So you've decided you want to create an original science fiction setting. A homebrew universe for a role-playing campaign, the background lore for a game or novel, or maybe Disney wouldn't let you make a Star Wars movie and now you're at Netflix desperately trying to rip them off. Could be for any number of reasons, or maybe you've decided to create something just for fun. Here at the Templin Institute, what you decide to do with your science fiction universe is none of our business. You've made a good choice though. I won't pretend to be unbiased here, but science fiction as a genre can be a lot of fun, with exciting tropes like space battles and weird aliens. But when you're just getting going, the possibilities open to you at this stage can be overwhelming. You might have the basic idea of your universe beginning to form, and maybe you've been able to distill it down into a few key central pillars that can help guide and structure your work. But how do you actually bring your setting to life? What should you be focusing on at this stage, and which decisions are going to open more interesting avenues to explore than they close? And perhaps most importantly, if you want to create a science fiction setting, how should you actually start? I have no idea. As we've discussed at great length, world building is a creative exercise, and the way people approach it is going to encompass every kind of method, style, and perspective. None of them, in my view, are any more correct than any other, and it simply comes down to what's most useful to you. So before anything else, a reminder that this series is not a guide to how to world build, but rather a guide to how I world build. Every world building project is different, and my approach might not be entirely for you, so take what you find useful and dump the rest. But this won't be all theory and abstractions. As part of our Way of Worldbuilding series, I'm also making my own science fiction universe called Dawn of Victory, to serve as a sort of case study for this series, and an opportunity for me to talk about the theories of world building and then put them into practice. And when I first introduced my science fiction setting, my approach was to take what I considered the central pillars of that universe, the unique core elements that will define Dawn of Victory, and provide a high-level overview of my philosophy or approach. In this video, I want to do more or less the same thing, but discuss not the elements unique to my setting, but science fiction settings in general. Things like aliens and warp travel, and how much of the universe your setting actually covers. All these elements will affect your universe and your world building, so if you can start with even a loose idea, you might be better off in the long run. But right away, we also have to acknowledge that science fiction setting as a general term encompasses quite a bit. From a single isolated home in the wilderness featuring an intimate and nuanced exploration of the ethical implications of creating sentient beings, to an entire galaxy full of aliens that must be eradicated without thought. Effective world building is going to look very different between those two settings, and in this video, we're focused more on examples of the latter. Technically, I want to discuss how to create what is sometimes called the Standard Sci Fi Setting, with interstellar empires, space battles, and maybe some weird supernatural element that ties it all together. The Standard Sci Fi Setting is a subgenre all of its own, so for more information about all its tropes and cliches, check the link in the description. Now, the central pillars of world building may be very different across the breadth of standard sci-fi settings, but there's a few I think most will have in common. In this video, we'll be going through them one by one. At the top are the all-encompassing, more ethereal decisions that will affect everything else in your universe. Things like any subgenre you might want to explore, and your setting's focus and tone. As I mentioned at the top, hopefully you already have even just a rough idea of what you want yours to be. If you want a refresher on the topic, a prior video in this series covers just that. We'll start with the location and extent of your setting. Is it in our galaxy or one far, far away? Does it cover a whole universe, or is it confined to just a single star system? Next, it's time frame or eras. How far into the future does it take place, if at all? Or does it exist beyond any frame of reference to our own calendar? The nature and role of technology. How advanced is it? Is it ubiquitous or tightly controlled? The existence of aliens or the metaphysical? Is humanity alone in the universe? Is there some kind of mystic force? Next, my personal favorite, the political and societal makeup of the setting. What are the major factions and geopolitics of your setting, and what do those societies look like? And finally, what is the major conflict at the heart of your setting? These are all big questions on their own, and in the future we'll be spending entire episodes covering some of them. For now though, because we're just starting to build our setting, we don't need to have everything figured out to the very last detail. In this video, we'll be sticking to the larger overarching decisions you might need to make in each of these sections. I'll give you my thoughts and opinions, and bring up some examples of mainstream sci-fi settings that I think handled these different pillars particularly well or poorly. Then we'll close with some general observations about all these elements as a whole. But don't forget, this is just part 1, covering the theory. In part 2, I put all these ideas into practice and start building my own sci-fi universe using the same structure I'm covering here. That video will be released tomorrow, with the next lore video from the Dawn of Victory universe coming on Sunday. Starting at the top, locking down your subgenre, tone, and focus early in the process is especially worthwhile since they'll influence every subsequent decision you'll make. They're among the more difficult things to change halfway through your world building, so having a solid understanding of each might save you some headaches down the road. Hopefully, the core pillars of your setting have already informed your choices here. At the very least, if you're watching this video, I'll assume you've decided on creating a science fiction setting, so let's start with some things to keep in mind while you're picking your subgenre, if any. As we've discussed, genres can be both beneficial and a bit of a prison to a setting. On the one hand, if you know you want to create something more military sci-fi or cyberpunk or Age of Sail in space, you immediately have a list of tropes and pieces of inspiration you can draw from. But on the other hand, by conforming to a specific genre, whether sci-fi, fantasy, whatever, you may be setting expectations and run the risk of alienating an audience if you deviate too much from established conventions. If you're looking to create a very specific type of universe, you're inspired by a particular niche in science fiction and you want to create something in that mold, immersing yourself in that particular subgenre might be a necessity. If you're looking to be more versatile and incorporate elements from a wider array of genres and sources of inspiration though, then the entire conversation surrounding genre might be more distracting than it is helpful. Genre in world building is another topic we've discussed before in this series, so be sure to check out that video if you'd like a more detailed overview. Moving on to tone. Tone, like genre, is another of these nebulous terms that in this context is meant to represent a convoluted interplay between narrative style, themes, realism, atmosphere, and emotional nuances. To put it another way, all the things that give a setting its feel. Sometimes tone can be as simple as describing a setting as dark or light, comedic or serious, gritty or cartoonish. And personally, I think that might be good enough when all you're really trying to do is create an internal frame of reference you can fall back on. Not everyone agrees, and they've created alignment charts in the style of Dungeons and Dragons to try to map out the different types of tone you commonly see across settings. You may have heard terms like noble bright being used to describe settings like The Lord of the Rings, or grimdark being used to refer to settings like real life. These terms are open to interpretation, but for the most part work like this. If a setting is noble, it means that the circumstances of the world can be easily changed. If it is grim, then circumstances are incredibly difficult to change or perhaps impossible. A bright setting might be utopian, or at least free from the worst forms of suffering or injustice, while a dark setting, surprise surprise, might be dystopian, filled with conflict, or just be generally bleak. From here, you can create any combination, grim, bright, neutral, dark, and so on. Personally, I think when you start getting this granular, trying to describe an inherently abstract concept like tone, the sorts of categories like noble, neutral, are just too open to interpretation to be universally useful. But as long as you know how you want your setting to feel and what the label you choose means to you, then the wording itself shouldn't really matter. Whether you describe your setting's tone as a mixture of grim bright and noble dark with some elements of grim dark and noble bright, all within a cosmology that borders on true neutrality, or your answer to the same question is just, it's gritty, the label is just a convenient shorthand. If you know what it means, that's good enough, so long as it gives you your bearings. But your bearings can be easy to lose, and unfortunately, I think tone is one of those things that only gets noticed when it's handled incredibly well or incredibly poorly. And if you can forgive me going into my first tangent here, I want to talk about an example of the latter. To find a setting that completely screwed up its own tone, I'd invite you to head to the battlefields of 2042. Environmental disasters have killed millions, nations have collapsed, a major part of the world's population are refugees and forced to fight in endless wars between crumbling superpowers. It is a grim, hopeless situation in which human civilization is likely nearing its end. And sometimes it feels that way, but you'd never know it from how the people actually living in this world talk most of the time.
Don't be sad. This is just how it works out sometimes.
Disparities in tone like this are more and more common in settings that have been built up over decades and influenced by different creators. Halo, Star Wars, Star Trek, Marvel, pretty much every major franchise has gone through some sort of shift in tone like this. As a Godzilla fan, the MonsterVerse in particular feels quite a bit different in 2024 than it did a decade ago. The fact that tone is so hard to define and so open to personal interpretation maybe makes this inevitable. When you have multiple different people working on a setting who might interpret its tone differently, or you want to appeal more to a mainstream audience, the tone of a setting might begin to drift. This isn't necessarily a bad thing though. Maybe your original vision wasn't quite working, or maybe you want to use disparities in tone as a deliberate tool in your world building. But in the case of Battlefield 2042, it feels more like the right hand just didn't know what the left hand was doing. The inconsistent tone here didn't feel deliberate, just jarring. Your mileage might vary, but I think Warhammer 40,000, Blade Runner, The Expanse, and others are all settings that have managed to retain a very specific tone and feel through strict creative direction and adherence to their core pillars. Lord of the Rings, Ravenloft from D&D, and BioShock would be some examples from fantasy. But now let's talk about the focus of your setting, something that again might be rather hard to define or distinguish. It's another complex topic, but I think we can come up with a simplified spectrum for this one too. Let's call it kitchen sink versus streamlined. A kitchen sink universe is vast, expansive, and teeming with a variety of ideas and narratives. There are some overarching rules that define certain elements, but for the most part, there is a huge degree of freedom when it comes to the kinds of stories you can tell. The DC and Marvel comic multiverses are the perfect examples of a kitchen sink universe. I'm not sure there's been a trope, idea, or concept that hasn't been featured in at least one movie or one issue. In terms of the standard sci-fi setting though, Star Wars is the natural comparison. It's often been described as a storytelling sandbox, where there's always another star system with new factions, characters, and conflicts. And yet, this universe is so successful because the galaxy has been designed in such a way that everything, or at least mostly everything, feels seamless. A streamlined universe is more limited in this regard. It has more rules and more constraints. There is far less freedom in the types of stories you can tell, but the setting has been designed to support a few kinds of story, with far deeper, more nuanced explorations of their core themes or ideas. Compared to Star Wars, a setting like Alien can seem almost barren. There isn't a whole galaxy out there, and it's more constrained in the types of factions, characters, and conflicts that might reasonably exist. Less sand in the sandbox, you might say. And yet the story and key themes of Alien wouldn't be anywhere near as effective if they had been told in the Star Wars galaxy. The universe of Alien has been streamlined to focus on a very specific type of narrative, the fear of the unknown, and this focused approach can be far more impactful when telling stories that play on those themes. But if you can forgive another slight tangent, Alien is also an interesting example of a streamlined setting that I think has almost gone too far in that direction. It might not be as expansive as Star Wars and the kinds of story it can tell, but as a setting and a franchise, I think it could really benefit from expanding its scope to explore different aspects of its own universe. The relationship between the megacorps, the ideological conflict between interstellar states, life on the harsh frontier. This is all interesting stuff, but usually relegated to the background as soon as the xenomorph shows up. Part of this is no doubt a branding problem. The franchise is called Alien after all, and you might feel cheated if one never shows up.
Now eventually you do plan to have dinosaurs on your dinosaur tour, right? Hello? Hello? Yes?
I really hate that man.
But I think its eponymous creature is actually holding the franchise back. I'm a fan of the Alien tabletop RPG by Free League, and they actually recommend that you don't use the xenomorph too often in your campaigns and try to explore other parts of the universe. I think that points to a problem in how this universe has been constructed. This is one of those problems that I feel rears its ugly head again and again whenever an established franchise is being turned midway through into an expanded universe designed to tell more types of stories. Not every story can be turned into a setting, though, without losing some of its original focus and magic. Or maybe the worst thing that will happen is that people are just slightly confused as to why you're telling a story without an alien in a franchise called Alien. Okay, tangent over. Boiling this all down to a few key points, advice, and questions to consider, something I've tried to reinforce in this series so far is that while things like genre, tone, focus, mood, whatever, are all important in helping to define your world, they're ultimately just like words, man. So go with whatever combination most accurately describes the swirling mass of ideas you have in your head. I don't think it matters how specific you get. And if you ever find yourself losing your perspective, you feel like your tone is getting away from you, or you're worried you've entered some weird subgenre, you can always refer to examples from other sources or your own well of inspiration to find your bearings again. Once you've done that, you need to decide what you want to focus on. A kitchen sink universe, in which case you probably want to initially concentrate your efforts on a way to make a bunch of disparate elements fit seamlessly together, or something more streamlined, where you'll have to work on emphasizing certain themes or elements at the expense of others. Once you've made some progress doing that, it's time to move away from the broader conceptual stuff into some more specific tangible aspects. Now, I've divided the standard sci-fi setting into a few categories I think are pretty universal. Yours might be different, and where you start is ultimately up to you, but remember that as we go through each of these aspects of your setting, they aren't entirely separate from one another. It's not a matter of figuring out one section of your world completely and then moving on to the next. Instead, you'll be coming up with ideas in all of these categories concurrently, as ideas and concepts in one will affect the others, sort of like a symbiont circle.
You and the Nabu form a symbiont circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this.
We should know care.
But in terms of which is the most important, I think an argument can be made for any aspect of a setting, but let's start with geography or astrography if you want to be more accurate. It's often been said that civilization is a prisoner of geography, perhaps most notably in the book Prisoners of Geography, and that is going to be every bit as true for an interstellar civilization as it is for our own. Human, alien, or otherwise, massive empires or scattered nomads, all will be shaped by the geography they inhabit. But before anything else, you should decide your setting's location. And I don't mean you should break out a telescope and look for some prime real estate. Rather, it comes down to a mostly binary choice. Does your setting take place within our own world, our own galaxy, our own history, or is it depicting an entirely separate universe with no connection to Earth or the Milky Way or humanity as we know it? Star Trek would be a good example of the former, and Star Wars the latter. Either approach has its benefits and challenges. If you include Earth in some capacity, you obviously now have the opportunity to incorporate real-world locations, cultures, etc. As a result, your setting might immediately have a greater sense of familiarity and authenticity. You also have the option of creating a speculative future, branching off from the time we inhabit now, something I've always found especially intriguing. But for your own setting, you might see connections to our own world as more of a drawback. Incorporating Earth and humanity as we know it into your setting can require more effort to create something that feels plausible. Because we all have at least a basic understanding of how our own world works, it's easier to spot elements that feel unrealistic or contrived when it's used as the basis for a science fiction setting. The suspension of disbelief becomes that much harder to maintain, and generally, there's much less freedom to deviate from established facts. By having your setting take place somewhere with no connection to Earth, you're free from all of this civilizational baggage. You can come up with an entirely new human society, free from the traditions, norms, and beliefs that have shaped our own. The Hagaran civilization from Homeworld is a great example of this. Outwardly, they appear mostly human, but their unique religions and complex societal makeup help them to really stand out as a distinct civilization. Of course, whether the Hagarans needed to be humans at all is another controversial question. The challenge, though, in separating your setting from humanity and Earth is that you might find it harder to get your audience invested in whatever alternative you come up with. Hagara on its own doesn't mean much to most people, and it will take a bit of time before they can find something about it that will resonate. Another drawback of this approach leads me to my next tangent. And maybe you won't care about this at all. I will be the first to admit this is a petty, nitpicky type of criticism, but I'm always slightly annoyed whenever a universe with no connection to our own includes concepts, ideas, and most commonly words and phrases that are unique to our own world and realistically shouldn't be there. Star Wars is especially bad at this. There are a ton of distinctly American colloquialisms and Latin words and phrases just flying around in that galaxy. Why are Snoke's bodyguards called Praetorians when the etymology of that word makes no sense in the Star Wars galaxy? Now, of course, the easy explanation for all of this is that these terms have been translated from Galactic Basic, or whatever the original languages might be, into English for the convenience of the audience. Maybe Snoke's Praetorian Guard is just the most appropriate term to describe them, and not their actual name. But this always feels like a bit of a lame excuse and a missed opportunity. Personally, I think if you don't want to include Earth in your story, you should try to commit to that choice as much as is practical. Come up with new names and phrases, rather than trying to leverage the power of existing concepts that realistically would not exist. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a binary choice. There are ways to blend elements of both options. One example is something like Dune. It's meant to take place in our own galaxy, and yet Earth is of no significance, having been lost behind myth and legend for centuries. It makes for an interesting contrast to something like Star Wars. The galaxy of Dune feels just as strange and alien, and yet when those same words and colloquialisms and distinct etymologies pop up, the kind of stuff that would otherwise annoy me, it's not a bug, it's a feature. People like to make fun of Duncan, Idaho for having a dumb last name, but I think it's actually a great piece of world building. There's a certain melancholy in knowing that the world we're living in now will eventually be reduced to a scattered collection of concepts, most of which have lost their original meaning. But once you've decided whether or not your universe is centered around Earth, the next part of your setting's geography is at scale. Within the standard sci-fi setting, you got a few broad options here. Planetary, your setting consists of a single world or maybe even a single region on that world. Anything in orbit or beyond might be mostly tangential. Examples might be something like Gears of War, where most of the action takes place in the world of Sarah, or the Tiberium universe of the Command & Conquer series, which is based mostly on Earth. Solar system. Your setting extends across a planetary system. It's likely there's multiple inhabited planets and moons with varying levels of interstellar infrastructure. Destiny is a good example of this. The Expanse is another. Both feature interstellar versions of humanity, mostly confined to the boundaries of our own solar system. Firefly is a slightly different example. Technically, it takes place within a cluster of 5 stars, but practically, it might as well be 1. Next, we have Interstellar. Your setting is on the scale of something like Halo, which takes place across a region of the galaxy many thousands of light years in size, but ultimately, it's still a small part of the Milky Way. Star Trek also fits into this category, along with, I think, most examples of the standard sci-fi setting. Finally, at the top, we have Galactic. Your setting extends across an entire galaxy with 100 billion stars, or maybe multiple galaxies with more stars than grains of sand on all the beaches of Earth. Warhammer 40,000 fits in here, Dune and Star Wars would as well. Now, this may seem like a mostly arbitrary way of classifying different science fiction settings. In the language of the genre, though, each category comes with certain expectations. For example, if a setting were to encompass an entire galaxy, we might expect the level of technology to be far in advance of what we currently possess. From that, we might then assume it takes place further into the future, assuming it's meant to portray the development of our own civilization. From this initial choice, it's easy to see how geography can begin to affect so many other categories on this list. Not that your setting needs to conform to these expectations, though. Subverting them can be equally effective. Stargate is a good example of this. Its setting extends across multiple galaxies despite taking place mostly in modern times. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the scale of your science fiction setting is almost a subgenre of its own. Each has its own tropes and conventions. For the most part, though, the standard sci-fi setting is usually interstellar or galactic in scale. This is a case where the expectations of the genre have kind of overtaken reality. Realistically, a single solar system represents an area far bigger than the human mind can imagine. And yet, because so much science fiction has come to revolve around warp drive or other types of faster-than-light travel, when a science fiction setting takes place only across a single planet or star system, or maybe even just a few star systems, it can feel constrained and limited. Some settings lean into this and make it work to their advantage. PlanetSide features colonists from an interstellar empire left stranded on a single world, while one of the main themes of The Expanse is humanity's confinement within the solar system due to a lack of faster-than-light propulsion. Destiny is a setting that tried to subvert this, and while I'm not going to claim to be an expert, I don't think it quite pulled it off. The world building of Destiny puts a lot of work and effort into making the solar system feel vast and mysterious, but fairly or not, when compared to its contemporaries, Halo especially, Destiny's setting comes across as more limited and small. Now, I'm sure my name is Bife, and plenty of other folks would fire the Gallahorn at me for saying such things, and if you're one of them, let me know in the comments why you disagree. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Galactic. The main benefit to a galaxy-sized setting is that you have pretty much unlimited space to work within. This might be mandatory if you're looking to create a kitchen sink style universe with a truly endless number of planets and aliens. There's also a great sense of weight that comes with a truly galactic civilization. This is something so far beyond our current capabilities and understanding that just like how a setting confined to a single system sort of automatically feels constrained, a galactic-sized setting is a simple way of making it feel grand, powerful, and boundless. But science fiction creators have often been accused of lacking any sense of scale, and this is an area in which I think the critics are right. The Milky Way galaxy is roughly 105,700 light-years across, has 100 billion stars, while scientific models speculate there could be 300 million worlds with similar conditions to Earth, and tens of thousands of alien civilizations. The idea that Star Wars, Dune, Foundation, Warhammer 40,000, or any other galactic-sized setting can properly reflect this sense of scale is absurd. Middle-earth and Westeros are often described as fully realized worlds. When you're following the journey of the Fellowship of the Ring or the War of the Five Kings, there is an extremely strong sense of place. In a show like The Expanse, the solar system also begins to feel this way. In contrast, though, the sheer enormity of an entire galaxy means the same level of intimacy is impossible in a setting that extends across that size. A team of writers working on Star Wars or Warhammer could spend 100 lifetimes coming up with planets and backstories, but ultimately, they'd still only be able to portray a tiny percentage of the total setting. But again, this can be a feature, not a bug. Warhammer 40,000 and Dune are two of my favorite examples of a setting that embrace the unfathomable scale of the universe. Just overcoming the distances between worlds is a major source of the conflict in both, while the scale of their respective imperiums is a large part of what gives each setting its narrative weight. Star Wars, by contrast, has just chosen to mostly ignore the realities of galactic scale. This does make some elements of the setting feel implausible or inconsistent. Hyperspace is a big example of this. The trade-off, though, is that Star Wars is easier to just jump into. It's more accessible and engaging for a broader audience. Star Wars treats a lot of its world building this way, and for a setting meant to be fun and full of adventure, this is probably the right call, although I still think it's gone a bit too far in places. I'm not sure I can say the same for the setting of Homeworld. On the one hand, having its civilizations needing to journey across large parts of an entire galaxy gives a tremendous sense of scale, but on the other hand, it introduces challenges in maintaining continuity and coherence. In Homeworld 1 especially, the Hagarans are not a spacefaring species, so to have them go from launching simple satellites to traveling across the entire galaxy in only a few decades seems a little implausible, even if the story does attempt to provide an explanation. A smaller setting, a region of the galaxy maybe, would have made some elements of the story feel more realistic, at the expense of the power and gravitas that comes with a truly galactic journey. Ultimately, decisions like that form the core of world building, and there may be no right answer. It just depends on which side of this you come down on. Okay, so what are the key takeaways of this blend of ramblings and madness? I'd say when you're figuring out your setting's geography, astrography, whatever, you start with a very clear decision to make. Is your setting in our region of the galaxy, featuring Earth and humanity as we know it, or at least implying it exists? Or are you following the galaxy far, far away approach, where maybe humanity exists, maybe it doesn't, but everything is taking place somewhere else in the universe far removed from Earth? Or maybe you found some clever way to blend the two, where it starts off as one but slowly transitions to the other, or some sort of hybrid mix. There's always plenty of ways to approach this. Next, decide on the extent of your setting. Are you thinking of a whole galaxy where much of it is left unseen, but the implied scale of events is greater than our ability to understand? Or something more focused, confined to a more localized region of space, but one you can explore more deeply? And again, there's nothing stopping you from taking a more hybrid approach. Your setting might extend across multiple galaxies and multiple dimensions, and yet most or all of your narratives are centered on a single region of space or a single planet. But whatever you decide, consider how it's going to affect all the other categories on my list here. If your setting extends across the whole of the galaxy, does that mean local civilizations have hyper-advanced technology? And if so, is that because they salvaged it from some way more advanced and ancient civilization, or because this takes place hundreds of thousands of years in the future at a time when mankind has naturally developed that capability? World building is a cosmic spiderweb where everything affects the other, or whatever Obi-Wan said about that symbiotic circle. But next on that cosmic spiderweb is your time frame. If your setting is one of those that does take place in a galaxy far, far away with no connection to Earth, this might be completely arbitrary. You're free to make up whatever calendar with whatever significance you want and choose a date from there. Done and done, nice and easy. But if you are trying to portray a futuristic version of Earth, then you might need to be more deliberate. When deciding how far into our future to have your setting take place, there's two main things to consider. The further your setting is into the future, the more time there is for advances in technology, shifts in society, the progression of history, and the evolution of human civilization. Consequently, you have much more freedom to incorporate futuristic, fantastical elements. If you want Earth to be the center of a vast interstellar empire, or some new invention to have become ubiquitous, you'll likely need to have your setting take place at least slightly into the future. But at the same time, the further into the future you look, the harder predicting changes and evolution becomes. Who knows what life is going to look like even a few years from now, let alone a few centuries? The only solution, it seems to me, is to resign yourself to the fact that no matter how much work you put into researching advancements in technology, societal trends, political developments, economic shifts, environmental changes, and cultural evolution, the further into the future your setting takes place, the more it will get quote-unquote wrong. But don't feel too bad. Science fiction is notorious for all the things it gets wrong. Everyone loves to make fun of landline phones appearing in what's supposed to be the 2020s, or famous historic events that never happened. The invention of social media is maybe the biggest example of something that mainstream sci-fi of the 1990s and 2000s failed to predict, and its absence is especially noteworthy in big franchises like Star Trek or movies like Minority Report. Before that, it was the internet. Before that, the atomic bomb maybe. The fact is, human civilization is going to evolve in ways that are completely unpredictable to us in the current era. And eventually, the future of human civilization will be just as strange and alien to us in the current era as our own time would be to the citizens of ancient Rome. And given the current pace of advancing technology and social norms, maybe exponentially more so. Something that's really put this in perspective for me is the idea that I could only go back about 200 to 300 years before my version of English would be completely unintelligible. Go back far enough and even fundamental concepts of the human experience might be expressed in very different ways. How far do you think you could travel into the future before encountering the exact same thing? Probably not as long. The standard science fiction setting doesn't care about this all too often. Some directly address it. Series like The Forever War are all about the effects of time dilation, and how soldiers returning from interstellar campaigns thousands of years after they left find Earth to be incomprehensible. The Expanse also touches on this by showcasing new cultures and languages that are just beginning to develop after centuries of space exploration. Maybe your setting fits into this model, and this is something you're going to really need to put a lot of thought into. But for the most part, in the standard sci-fi setting, regardless of how far into the future it is, 21st century humanity has been more or less relocated there and is otherwise unchanged apart from maybe a few superficial differences. I don't have a huge problem with this. Ultimately, your audience is likely going to be people in this century, so it's not a flaw to make sure your setting isn't too unfamiliar and alienating to them. But I don't think you should take that as an excuse to pick the current year of your setting arbitrarily. There is still a sweet spot. You want an era set far enough into the future to allow for whatever tropes in future history you might want to incorporate, but not a date so distant that you can't possibly justify why civilization hasn't changed as dramatically as it naturally would. Where that sweet spot is for you will depend on the nature of your story and probably come down to your gut feeling. Or maybe you don't care at all. But Mass Effect is a universe that my gut feeling says just barely hit the sweet spot. The first game opens in 2183, about a century and a half from now. Society still feels very familiar, but smaller details like a largely multi-ethnic human race and a futuristic yet relatable art direction is enough to convey that mankind is not societally stagnant. The problem is, I don't think a date of 2183 is far enough into the future to explain some other elements of the setting. Part of this has more to do with how Mass Effect structures its timeline rather than the actual date, which explains that humanity has only been in contact with the galactic community for 2 decades or so. This feels like barely enough time for the human race to have become so integrated into galactic society in the manner in which it's repeatedly portrayed. Pushing the timeline back a few more decades into the future, or having first contact occur earlier, might have helped in this regard. Star Trek Discovery, meanwhile, has recently pushed the setting the furthest into the future it's ever been, the 31st century. I think this is a terrible idea, and I'm sure in a future Templin Institute video, I'll tell you all about it. For now, though, I'll simply say this choice exemplifies all the issues that come with not thinking about the consequences of your time frame. Realistically, 31st century humanity should be unrecognizable to us. Socially, culturally, technologically, we might not even consider them to be humans anymore. The fact that they're not, and that humanity seems pretty much entirely the same after 1,000 years, inadvertently makes us as a species seem devoid of meaningful cultural evolution, which should not be a thing in a Star Trek show. Of course, there are some tricks that you can use to give yourself a bit of wiggle room in this regard. Most standard sci-fi settings include some sort of calamity, usually World War III, to serve as a narrative reset button and justification for why humanity hasn't changed as much as it might have otherwise. Warhammer 40,000 takes this to the extreme and uses its time frame to justify both a lack of change and extreme change simultaneously. By taking place so far into the future and portraying a version of humanity that has risen and fallen again and again and again, the setting can justify pretty much whatever it wants. One of the major themes of 40K is that cycles of civilizational collapse have created a nightmarish hodgepodge of anachronistic elements that all feel entirely plausible within the narrative. This probably would not be as effective if it was set just a few hundred years into the future as opposed to 40,000. I also want to give a quick shout out to All Tomorrows, a billion-year chronicle of the myriad species and mixed fortunes of man, which made some waves on the internet a few years ago, and rightfully so. It explores these same themes in a really effective, haunting way. So boiling this down to my few key points. If your setting doesn't take place in our universe using our calendar, your time frame might be mostly arbitrary. You can invent your own calendar, your own date, and then take the rest of this section off and go see a movie, while the rest of us have some questions to consider. Because if you do want to portray a futuristic version of Earth or humanity, are you concerned with your setting taking place so far into the future that humanity as we know it would realistically be unrecognizable? Is that something you want to directly address? Or maybe you want to take this even further and have your setting take place so far into the future that humanity as we know it might have risen and fallen, been so utterly transformed so many times that the passing eons can be used to justify pretty much anything. But if you answered no to that prospect, if you want to create a version of the future with advanced technology and cool starships and space battles and all that stuff, but a still mostly recognizable version of modern humanity, try and find that sweet spot. A time frame you consider far enough into the future to justify whatever advanced technology you might want to incorporate, yet not so far into the future that humanity's resemblance to contemporary society might inadvertently make it come across as stagnant or regressive. And of course, there's a few ways to get around this or cheat. Maybe advanced technology was found on modern-day Earth that immediately propelled our knowledge of the universe forward by a few centuries. Or maybe World War III or some other terrible cataclysm pulled humanity down into a temporary dark age, and that's why the 24th century feels a lot like the 90s. Or maybe you just don't care at all. That's fair enough, but one day, the Templin Institute might need to make a video explaining why your massively popular and successful science fiction universe actually doesn't work at all. And are you sure you want that? I can tell you that neither Chris Roberts or George Lucas have ever recovered. And now we come to the science part of the science fiction setting. We've all heard the phrase that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and in world building especially, I think that's true. Technology is to science fiction what magic is to fantasy. Something to enhance the world building, drive the plot, explore themes, develop character, serve as a metaphor, and create conflicts or solve problems. And it's very possible your setting is an extensive deep dive into the effects of one or a select few types of sci-fi technology. In that case, you're probably already deeply considering something I feel the rest of us need to be reminded of. One of those convenient uses for technology during world building, solving problems, is something those of us with less focused settings might rely on for quite a bit in the early days of constructing our universes, universi. If the problem is that star systems in the real world are really far apart, the solution is warp drive. Most planets are gross, solution terraforming. Every alien talks like a weirdo, solution universal translators. Technology is going to help you to overcome some of the inherent problems of reality and let you tell your story however you want while retaining at least some level of plausibility. But technology can't just be a get-out-of-space jail free card, because realistically, even if you add some piece of tech just to solve a problem or plot hole, it's still going to affect other aspects of your setting, its cultures and industries especially, in ways you might not anticipate. It's important to remember that any piece of technology, any scientific discovery, no matter how mundane it might initially appear, has the potential to cause a societal earthquake. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered mold in a petri dish killed the surrounding bacteria. Fast forward a century, and technology derived from that discovery is used to mass-produce penicillin, and an estimated 500 million lives have all been saved. Electrical power, medical imaging, plastics and polymers, these have all transformed human society to a far greater extent than even those involved in their invention or discovery may have realized was possible. Now more than ever, we are living in a time where the rapid pace of change means new discoveries are being made and new inventions introduced that are going to ruin all of our lives in ways we can't even imagine right now. So if something as outwardly simple as penicillin helped shape the modern world, and something as innocuous as Facebook helped to ruin it, what is something like anti-gravity, warp drive, or cybernetics going to do? Incorporating advanced technology, mainly because you needed it to solve some problems or you just want a more intriguing backdrop with starships and warp drive, is part of the appeal of the standard sci-fi setting. But considering the effects of these technologies across other aspects of civilization will help your setting feel cohesive and believable. Or it can create more problems than it solves. Star Trek, rather famously, invented the transporter because filming a shuttlecraft model landing on a different planet every week was too expensive. This was a fun and creative solution to a unique problem, and since then, situations involving the transporter have produced some of Star Trek's best episodes. But it's also created some additional issues, because there is suddenly an extremely powerful device that in theory should be capable of solving numerous plot challenges way too easily. Now, whenever a conflict arises that the transporter would reasonably be expected to solve, a character needs to go out of their way to exclaim that mineral deposits, exotic radiation, electromagnetic storms, trinimbic interference, or 1,000 other things have rendered the transporters useless. I will give Star Trek some credit though. It is inferred in a subtle but pretty effective way that the industrial and civil application of transporters is what's contributed to Earth's post-scarcity economy. A great example of showing the effect of technology on a society without being too heavy-handed. Foundation, meanwhile, the TV series, not the book, let's make that very clear, has taken technology as a solution to problems to brave new extremes. So many problems are solved or explained away by evoking some kind of advanced technology, only for that technology to then disappear. There is no exploration of the ramifications, or how one piece of advanced technology interacts or affects another. It's just a hodgepodge of sci-fi concepts that only serve to weaken the primary themes of the series. This is a danger I see repeated again and again. Say what you want about Star Wars, and I've contributed my share, but that entire setting feels very deliberate in how it introduces more fantastical technology, integrating it seamlessly or sporadically, as opposed to overwhelming an audience with everything all at once. By contrast, Jupiter Ascending is guilty of this, and 114 other charges which for the expediency of justice will not be read. But we implore the harshest sentencing from the officers of the Templin Institute's Palace of Vengeance. But technology doesn't only need to be invoked in a science fiction setting to solve problems like why Channing Tatum is a half-dog or something. But just as its effects will have consequences on a civilization and your setting as a whole, the absence of technology can be just as consequential. We are lucky to live in a time in which the barrier to accessing technology is the lowest it has ever been. Not everyone has the latest iPhone, but a substantial majority of the world's population has access to global telecommunications, and that barrier to entry is being lowered in most places. As we've already discussed, this might not be true in 40,000 years or so, but for the most part, we don't live in the shadow of technologically advanced wonders and past glories whose majesty we can never hope to replicate. Many examples of the standard sci-fi setting take this state of affairs for granted. Contrast that with a setting like Dune, in which a unique kind of regression has occurred. Certain technologies are forbidden, there is an increased reliance on mental conditioning, and most people do not interact with technology in the same extent we do today. Only the highest strata of citizens within the great houses might be exposed to advanced technology on a regular basis, with the common people and the Fremen of Arrakis entirely removed from or choosing to live without what might be basic necessities elsewhere. Stargate is another setting that incorporates this idea. The Goa'uld Empire purposely restricts and preserves its slave caste within a technologically regressed state, while the ruling class maintains a high level of sophistication as a means of ensuring their control and personal luxury. The ubiquity or absence of advanced technology, or the relative scarcity of technology between geographic areas, societal classes, alien races, or other dividing lines, can be just as interesting as the starships and warp drive that technology makes possible. It's important to remember that the pace of technological advancement and societal change is not guaranteed, though. As we've touched on when discussing your setting's time frame, the distant future might be technologically alien to us or pitifully backwards, while a lack of change in technology after a certain period of time might cause humanity to appear stagnant. Maybe this is something you want to focus on directly, and the pace of technological development slowing down or speeding up or hitting a brick wall is a major part of your setting. And at the risk of picking on Star Wars too much, I think this is another aspect of that setting's world building that's been entirely ignored to its detriment. The technology available thousands of years ago in the era of the High and Old Republic is more or less the same as what's available to the Galactic Empire and the New Republic. I mean, sure, some things are mentioned as being technologically inferior in the distant past compared to the more modern eras, but it's usually in some trivial aspect or in a way that doesn't change galactic civilization in any meaningful way. And maybe that's just seen as the normal pace of change in this universe. But it does feel rather incongruent for new starships and new walkers and new stormtrooper helmets to imitate the progression of technological development, only for the result of this new technology to be cosmetic changes or no change at all in some cases. I can't help but think that eras like the Clone Wars, the Old Republic, and other distant parts of the Star Wars timeline might have been more interesting or distinct from one another if major aspects of that universe were missing or worked in a different way. And so we'll end this section on the few key points I think you should consider when figuring out the role of technology in your science fiction setting. First, know your focus. Are you doing a deep dive into the effects of a specific discovery or a new family of technologies? Or do you see the role of tech in your universe more as just a way to justify some cool elements and solve some problems? A hybrid approach is also possible here. But no matter which way you go, just remember that with each new piece of technology you incorporate, its effects are going to spiral outwards. Try and look outside the box as much as possible. If transporters exist, how does that change every industry, from logging to theme park design to domestic travel? Is working from another continent no longer a big deal? Can everyone instantly commute from a cabin in the mountains to the big city? What's the point of shuttlecraft at all? Is there exotic radiation or electromagnetic interference in Montana? And after that, consider that technology can be both a driver of societal change or a symbol of stagnation and decline. Our own world moves at such a rapid pace that anything less might feel glacial by comparison. But that's not something you necessarily have to explain away. Consider the peaks and valleys of technological golden and dark ages, and consider whether your setting is in one of those extremes, or perhaps just emerging from an era of stagnation or innovation, or just entering one. And next on our list of standard sci-fi setting categories is aliens. One of the great features of any sci-fi setting, aliens offer a chance to explore themes of diversity, otherness, fear of the unknown, or serve as metaphors for a variety of other real-world issues and challenges. A unique alien race can help define your setting while adding depth and richness to your world building. There are any number of ways that adding alien races and civilizations can contribute to your setting. One of the most common, of course, is by providing a fresh perspective on familiar concepts. Star Trek is the master of this, with the crew of each series usually including at least one alien character whose purpose is to provide some commentary on the nature of humanity. The problem is, I think most of us have gotten pretty wise to this, and a lot of the tropes associated with aliens in the standard sci-fi setting have been overused and are now a little tired. Any fan of the genre will be familiar with aliens with weird bumpy heads, but who are otherwise identical to humans. In fact, Star Trek Discovery recently continued an older story arc whose sole purpose was to explain away why so many alien species look alike. But that's not the only trope that's gotten a little old. How many more times do we need to see an alien character ruminate on what makes humans so special, or express their surprise and confusion at some human expression? This trope has become so well known that there's a whole genre of AI-generated slop right now devoted to stories where aliens are shocked by how badass humans are again and again and again. And on the one hand, this isn't the worst thing in the world. I think it's forced mainstream science fiction to try to grow up a bit in how they portray extraterrestrial life. Arrival is probably the most popular example of a story that really nailed this. I would also add Annihilation to that list. And both work so well because these aliens are not foils for humanity or reflections of our own behavior, but forces that challenge our understanding and confront us with something genuinely otherworldly. Avatar took a different approach and invested far more time, and more importantly, more money, to bring new credibility to that more classic portrayal of alien life. Classic in the sense that they represented an aspect of humanity rather than some abstract idea. By developing the Na'vi so fully and committing themselves so earnestly to creating a unique species, the creators of Avatar, if nothing else, overcame the stigma of cheap costumes and played out gimmicks long associated with aliens and sci-fi, or at least gave some new life to them. District 9, though, did this even better. Where the Na'vi relied on little tricks to get an audience to empathize with them, big, round eyes and a perfect, tranquil society, the prawns achieved the exact same result, with me anyways, despite their grotesque appearance and savage behavior. I'll admit proudly that I'll watch that giant tree get burned down by napalm 1,000 times and all those Na'vi's big eyes filling up with tears before my own frigid heart warms a fraction of how it did when Christopher Johnson showed his son which tent would be theirs in District 10, sparing his son from the hurtful knowledge that it offered no actual help or safety. It's been encouraging to see mainstream science fiction move away a bit and expand outwards from the tired cliches of the genre and embrace stories like Arrival that shift how aliens can be portrayed, or Dune in which they are absent entirely. The Expanse and the appropriately named Alien franchise are also deliberately and masterfully restrained in how they incorporate aliens into their respective settings. So here are my takeaways. If you're developing a kitchen sink universe and you just need to populate a bar full of weird creatures for your characters to walk through, go wild. A variety of aliens can be effective set dressing when conveying the sheer size of a galactic community. If you want to focus on aliens more fully, decide if you want to have them represent some existential abstraction or be a reflection or challenge to humanity's own ideals. And if you go that latter route, be aware that audience expectations have evolved. I think the mostly humanoid aliens ruminating on humanity while standing around a bar concept can still work, but they can't be caricatures or cartoons, and should instead be as fully cooked as the average prawn. Now we come to geopolitics, a topic that the Templin Institute has discussed extensively. But I think this is something you really need to consider, as it will be important in most versions of the Standard Sci Fi Setting. Geopolitics defines the relationship between your different nations, factions, or organizations, whatever kind of polity has authority over the physical space in your setting. It is also something that I think is increasingly glossed over in mainstream science fiction to the detriment of its world building. So please forgive this rather brief overview of something we've covered a few times before, but is especially important in crafting some interesting relationships between any nations or factions your setting might have, and that's the concept of polarity. Polarity describes the way power is distributed between sovereign countries. There are many ways to measure power, but we understand that by whatever metric you choose, some countries will inherently be more powerful than others. In a unipolar world, one country possesses a hegemony over all others and faces no peer competitors. An example from our world is arguably the period between the fall of the Soviet Union and September 11th, when American power was at its peak. A unipolar science fiction setting would be the galaxy of Star Wars under the rule of the Galactic Empire or the Republic. In a bipolar world, two states possess the same capability and may come to rival and compete with one another, directly or indirectly. An example from our world would be the relationship between France and Great Britain over the first half of the 18th century. Halo, and specifically the bloody relationship between the UNSC and the Covenant, is a science fiction example of this. And finally, in a multipolar world, many nations are equally powerful. The period before World War I is a historical example, and many commentators assert that the modern world is increasingly becoming a multipolar one as well. An example of a science fiction multipolar world would be something like Babylon 5, with its myriad of alien races, some of which act as rivals or competitors to Earth. I really believe that for most settings, a multipolar universe is the way to go. For a more detailed explanation as to why, check out our What Makes a Good Setting video, but the TLDR is that a multipolar world simply gives you more options in your narratives. The example I keep going back to is Halo. When the franchise only consisted of those first few games, having a bipolar world split between the UNSC and the Covenant kept the focus of the setting right where it needed to be, on the war that Master Chief was fighting his way through. But once that geopolitical conflict was resolved, there was nowhere else immediately obvious for the setting to go. As Halo has moved on from the Human Covenant War and tried to become more of an expanded universe with novels, games, comics, etc., the world building has become more convoluted as new threats need to appear, mostly out of nowhere. If you are dead set on having a bipolar or unipolar universe, don't worry, there are ways to get around this problem. The main one will come down to how you design your factions. Including many internal sub-factions can help to replicate geopolitical complexities, but we're still a few videos away from that one, so sit tight for now. Instead, here are my key takeaways. If geopolitics is going to be even a moderately important part of your setting, decide the polarity of your world. A unipolar world can be more focused, a multipolar world gives you more geopolitical storytelling options. And as a quick prelude to the next episode of the Way of Worldbuilding, which will cover geopolitics in detail, consider which factions in your setting are the ones that are allowed to show up on the map. What I mean by that is, in the modern world, the answer is nations. We even imbued states with the sole authority to govern territories, but there are other options. Historically, nations and kingdoms have shared sovereignty with religious organizations, city-states, mercenary groups, guilds, tribal confederations, any one of which might show up on the map as the ruler of a set territory. In a science fiction setting, it's easy to see megacorps, supranational unions, space pirates, and mercenaries fulfilling the same role. Maybe some of them have grown so powerful that they're actually competing for sovereignty in your setting. Now that brings us straight into our last section, conflict. Your setting might not have one, or at least not one the entire setting revolves around. Or maybe the conflict of your setting is more cerebral. Star Trek has had its share of interstellar wars and clashes of character, and yet the central conflict of the setting as a whole might be expressed as humanity versus the unknown, or rationality versus ignorance. A conflict like that has the benefit of being impossible to resolve, so the stories can go on forever. If you are taking the more traditional route, and good versus evil or some kind of war is a central element of your setting, our next few videos in this series will be right up your alley. But ultimately, your conflict will be personal to your setting, and there are only a few high-level things I can offer that will be helpful at this stage. First, and perhaps most obviously, figure out who is fighting who and why. From there, you can start listing the other big questions. How long has this conflict been going on? What is its intensity? Is it just ramping up or winding down? What are the stakes? What is it exactly that's being fought over? How does this conflict affect your setting, from individuals to governments? And have there been any major events, turning points, or reversals in the history of your setting? Now, as I think I mentioned, our next episode will be covering geopolitics, and geopolitical conflicts will be a large part of that. And we'll be revisiting other types of conflicts throughout the remainder of this series, so I hope that brief overview will suffice for now. But I want to try to bring things together at the end here with some concluding thoughts. Throughout this guide, I've tried to point out all the different high-level choices you have, the options that make the most sense to me, and how they'll impact other decisions you might need to make across these categories or later down the line. And I've tried to highlight which combinations of choices seem to work well together, like how a kitchen sink universe makes a lot of sense in a galactic-sized setting, or how including more aliens can lead to more interesting geopolitics. And it might be tempting to take everything I've said and see it as a blanket statement. This is the proper way to world build, and every other option or combination is wrong. But in the end, these are only the decisions that I think make things immediately feel more plausible or conform to the standards of the standard sci-fi setting. But the beauty of world building is its flexibility. You can make some decisions that on the surface don't seem like they would work well together at all. A science fiction setting spread out across multiple galaxies that takes place in our own modern era without any advanced technology, and come up with a way to give that depth and consistency. Or maybe you want to dedicate your focus only on one aspect of your universe, creating some really detailed aliens, and you don't really care about geopolitics or any of the rest of it. In that case, relying on the basic framework of the Standard Sci Fi Setting can free you up to develop the parts of the world you're more interested in. Now, before we close out, a reminder that this is just part 1 of a 2-part episode. I know, right? How long can this guy talk about science fiction? But well, in this video I covered theories and questions. In part 2, I'm putting them into practice and giving you my answers for my own standard sci-fi setting, Dawn of Victory. My setting takes place in 2285. I am convinced this was a brilliant decision that makes me a world-building genius. Dustin Hoffman once starred in a movie called Sphere. There is a line of dialogue in that film that completely changed the way I felt about aliens. World-building takes you to weird, strange places. So if you'd like to see my process in action, head over to the Dawn of Victory YouTube channel. Part 2 will be live there 24 hours after this video is first posted. And finally, as I mentioned, our next episode of the Way of Worldbuilding will be all about geopolitics. So if you have any comments or questions or whatever else related to geopolitics, let me know in the comments. And until then, remember that world building is a lot like Zombo.com. The only limit is yourself.